Hey everybody, welcome back to the Engage podcast. Ryan Argenta here, your host. Today I'm here with Rich Wheeler. He's the Delta MEC Executive Administrator. And Rich has a long history, not just with the company and not just with Alpa, but in his own personal experience. He's been a negotiator. He just negotiated contract 2019 and went through all of the details there. He's been in scheduling, numerous positions in the union and in the Delta MEC. Rich, welcome back. Happy to have you on in this capacity. And you're just such a great resource. I always call you the walking encyclopedia, but you also have a great way of storytelling. And so I wanted to bring you on as part of our Negotiators series, which is ongoing, to talk about Section 6 as we gear up for openers and exchanging of openers in the first week of April of this year, here not much longer. I want to open the floor to you to what you want to message to the pilot group. Give us a historical aspect, maybe some war stories, and walk me through there. And I do have some questions for you as we prepare for another round of Section 6. But again, thanks for being here and let it rip.
Ryan, thanks. It's always a pleasure to be on your show. I think this is a great format. I know sometimes I even go back and replay the old podcasts. I drive 90 minutes to work, and so it's always fun to dial them back and hear some of the stuff that we've covered. Well, just briefly, I don't want to go into and have a brief history of time kind of rant here, but the pilot contract here at Delta goes back, believe it or not, to 1940. We've had obviously dozens of contracts since then. They all do kind of stem from a common source. If you go back and, we have all the former contracts up on the wall there in the Negotiators library. You can pull down a contract from, say, 1952, and you can flip through it and you can see the common threads that are and generally common to other airlines, but also unique to our particular pilot group. Every pilot group has its own individual culture, their own individual kind of ideas of what's important to them. And you can see these woven through the contracts over the decades. As we move forward, some of these things fall in and out of favor. For instance, back in the 1980s, they did a survey and we had 80% of the pilots at Delta were local. And that number certainly has changed. I believe that the last few surveys we've seen, it's been more of a 50-50 mix. Back in the day, it was very important for progression to avoid stagnation. So there were hard limits on the amount of time that you could fly during the month. This existed well into the mid 2000s. This has waned somewhat as the culture and the nature of airline flying has changed. And so as you move in through these different contracts, you see things change, the emphasis changed, and that's always important to go back and take a look at. I was hired at Northwest in 1998, came over in the merger. The two contracts were kind of illustrative of how the different cultures can be different. For instance, at Northwest, it was very focused on the wide body flying. It was very focused on individual aspects that were peculiar to that kind of operation. Delta side was a little bit different. And obviously through the merger, we had a meeting of the minds and we're moving forward. I'll give you one pretty good example at Northwest. The ability to change your schedule was very limited. It was kind of an arcane process. Open time, as we called it, ran once a day. And it was very, very hard to change your schedule to the extent that we can today. On the Delta side, that was very much a priority, and there were multiple ways to change your schedule. We have open time through PCS, we have trip coverage, and we have the file upward. So as we go forward, we always have the common things that we're always interested in every contract. Scope is always very important. We have pay, working conditions, and benefits. And you will see those as a focus on almost every contract. And then also you want to go in and try to resolve some individual issues that crop up. I know trip coverage this time around is a hot topic. I'm sure that'll be discussed with Bill Finley's team, who's the chairman of the negotiating committee. They have a great team, all just absolutely extremely smart people. I'm not a boomer. I'm a Generation X. But it surprises me very much how dialed in these guys are and continue to be as I get enter my grumpy stage in my life. So,
You're not a boomer, but you can play one on TV when you need to.
absolutely. So, as we go forward, it's important to realize that the negotiators take their direction directly from the MEC, that's your elected representatives. That's how they done. They have just concluded that process. It took the course of a few special meetings where the individual reps gathered. They looked at the survey data, they looked at the polling data, and they saw and narrowed down what was truly important to the pilot group. And then they gave their direction directly to the negotiators. Obviously, the negotiations don't take a couple of weeks. They take much longer than that. Certainly, the company has their interests. We have our interests. There are a lot of technical details. So the negotiators get their plan together from their direction. They have their individual terms that they want to meet with the company with. The company has their terms. And when they get together, they exchange and they try to find common ground. It can be a long process. It can be a quick process. It just really depends on the motivation of the individual parties. So as we move forward, you're going to see the communications from the negotiators. They put out their notepads directly to the pilot group. They are the absolute best resource. So when you see the negotiators put something out, that is directly from the source. The next best thing is obviously your reps. You're going to call into your council reps, and they're usually more than happy to talk to you on the phone, talk to you via email. Text messages are not the best way to really handle things, just simply because they can get lost in the noise sometimes. So if you really want the straight news, pick up the phone via voice and talk to your representatives, and they're always happy to take the time and talk to you.
That was a great overview of the process and the things that you've seen since 1998, and obviously being in these various positions, and especially most recently a negotiator. I want to ask you, and I'm sure you encounter this when you fly as well. You fly with people in various seniorities, right? It doesn't matter. And people say, oh, we need to get rid of this piece of the contract, or why don't we get points from hotel stays? How do you reconcile for pilots? Like, what do you want to say to pilots when you have that idea, or maybe you've put it in a survey? How does the MEC and the negotiators understand those long histories, right? Because, for example, you and I had a conversation. I was prepping for an episode and I mentioned something about unable to commute. And you said, oh yeah, that went back to contract 2000. And we wanted an unable to commute policy. And the company came back and said, yeah, but the flights have to be 2 hours apart. And we agreed to it. How do the negotiators and the MEC ensure that we don't give up something that we fought hard for in previous cycles? And how do we gain things that maybe we don't want? Or like, well, we tried that in contract 2012 and it turns out we don't want that. What's your messaging there?
Well, I would say that history is extremely important with this, and the negotiators have a vast library, both digital and, believe it or not, we have a physical library that you can go back into and look at the negotiator notes and the different materials that going back well into the 80s. So knowing the history is very important, and also understand that with the contract, there are things that it's designed to provide and things that are designed to prevent. Obviously, pay and retirement and healthcare are all those kinds of things that the PWA is designed to provide. And then when you get into work rules, these are things that they're designed to prevent. And just about everything in the contract is there for a reason. And some of the challenges that I have is I will be flying with somebody, and I will give you a great example, is open time. As everyone's current issue du jour, it appears. So I'll fly with somebody, especially somebody who came from one of the regional airlines or one of the other airlines that are out there, and they'll say, why can't we just have a real-time open? It's like, I got my phone, it updates every 30 seconds, and I see a trip, and I just want to hit the trip and be done with it. And that sounds great, but the overall culture and the overall history of open time, certainly at Delta, has always been seniority based, always. And so there needs to be process in place that has to play out for a seniority component in open time. And then there's the practical implications of that. Just about every airline that I've seen that has a real-time open board has the same problem, and that's with automated programs, or as they call them, bots. where there's automation that people employ that is not really sanctioned by the company, but in most cases, companies don't care, right? They got a button, a seat, mission accomplished for them, right? But when you have these automated processes that are not particularly sanctioned, that leads to a lot of trouble, a lot of heartache, and a lot of grumpiness between pilots, which we would just as soon avoid. And by putting in some processes there to make sure seniority is honored, is one way to fix that. And that's just simply one microcosm of how we look at contract priorities. And sometimes, you have to broaden your aperture. For our military pilots, he put in an entire career. They get out of the military. They have access to TRICARE. They may ask themselves, well, hey, why am I funding with my contract dollars, healthcare? Or those kinds of conversations are difficult. But the end answer is always that we are one pilot group, a unified pilot group. Sometimes, you do things and get pay, benefits, working conditions that benefit the group as a whole. That's part of the program. That's part of the career.
Yeah, and that's the great piece is that everybody has the opportunity to give feedback through surveys, through the reps, through, darts and emails, like you said. And you also have a vote. And so if you want to stick to your priorities and those weren't accomplished, then you get to vote no. If your priorities were accomplished and you're happy with the overall contract, you get a vote. And so, yeah, that was a great answer to, how come, right? We also I get that a lot of how come we can't have this? And so that was a great answer to that. And I guess if you're feeling like, well, I gave some feedback on my priorities and it just doesn't seem to be happening, or it's not even on the radar, then perhaps what you're saying is, well, it was on the negotiators' radar, but looking back in those history books, they've come to find, well, we tried that and it didn't work, or this isn't something that's a priority for the pilot group as a whole, 17,500 pilots. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, absolutely. My wife is a veterinarian and she has a saying, sometimes it breaks your heart, but at the end of the day, you can't save all the kittens. And that is true. It's true in contract negotiations too. We would all love to get 100% of all, not only our collective needs and desires, but our individual needs and desires. And everybody has their assortment of need that they feel are extremely important to them. And sometimes in the end calculus, it just, things drop off. Things are not deprioritized, but the items of other import take precedence. And like I said, like she said, you can't save all the kittens sometimes. And the best ideas are saved for next time, or the best ideas are saved for opportunities that may present themselves in the future. And they always keep a good repository of that. Obviously, as you pointed out, you always have your vote, say yay or nay. I would just ask that people read all the material that gets sent out. We kind of have a joke that sometimes people open the contract or the tentative agreement to Section 3, which is compensation. They look at the pay rate and that's all they read. And that's certainly it's within your individual rights to do that. That's what's important to you. Then boom, you're done. You go back to doing what you were doing. But if you were going to engage beyond that, I would ask that you definitely read all the material. There's a lot of nuance. And it's interesting, we get asked a lot about professional negotiators. That comes up light to occasional intermittents on that. I would simply say that most professional negotiators go in and negotiate a deal for an actor or an athlete. Those contracts are 6 or 8 pages long, unless they're some kind of superstar that is really going to, say, hey, I need a jar of brown M&Ms. These contracts are fairly simple. Our contracts are so entwined. Every section of this contract practically interacts with another set in sometimes very subtle ways, and language matters. And, we do have professional negotiators, our team of attorneys from both locally and at national, but nobody is going to negotiate as hard for the things that matter most to pilots than pilots. And we have people who are way down in the weeds, knowing and understanding the individual nuances of every section and how they interact with each other. And that is something somebody just in off the street they could come in and they could spend 5 years studying our contract, but until they've gone out and lived it, flown the line, and gotten those ACARS messages and gotten those phone calls and had those interactions with the company, would they truly understand why individual things are so important?
We talked about professional negotiators in the opener for the Negotiators series, which is Meet the Team, taking us into section 6. I'd encourage everybody to listen to that and follow along in this ongoing negotiator series. But they hit on that hard that, you could bring in somebody to negotiate who's not a pilot, and they get paid probably a lot of money from our dues dollars. And then they negotiate and walk away, and they don't have to live under the contract. Their livelihoods don't depend on the contract that they've negotiated. And so I want people who have skin in the game. And that's why we have the team that we have. I interrupted you. I want you to finish that thought. But the question I want to ask, not trivia, but just some fun tidbits, because we don't always see behind the curtain. And it's kind of like what people don't know about negotiations, and something that you might have as a negotiator that happens that pilots don't know or pilots aren't aware of.
That's a great segue. So I remember we were finishing up 2019. And so it was the end of 2022. And it was myself and our current MEC chairman, Eric Criswell, and Brandon Conwell, who's the current vice chairman. And we had just concluded the MEC meeting where we presented the TA. And we're in the MEC meeting room. This was in Raleigh, Durham. And so the meeting is over, and now we have a tentative agreement. And as we are sitting there writing the negotiator's notepad to send to the pilots, because obviously people are chomping on the bit, because that kind of news does not stay in any kind of jar, right? It gets out right away. And, we had anticipated that. And so our team comes in, our staff comes in, and they break down the meeting space, right? There's tables and microphones and podiums and whatnot. And we are literally doing the notepad sitting on shipping crates. And eventually our folks done, and they're like, look, we've got everything packed. So, sit on the crate as long as you need. And then the hotel people come in, and now they're breaking down their part of the room. And so by the time that we got done writing the notepad and getting it ready to get into the communications process, we're sitting in a completely empty room, and there's one shipping crate left because the rest had been pushed out to the loading dock to get shipped back to Atlanta. We're literally on one shipping crate trying to get this notepad edited. We all had to catch the 10 p.m. flight back to Atlanta. So, of course, that goes with the job. When you sign up to be a negotiator, if you sign up to be a committee person or whatnot, sometimes you have days like that. We had very, very long days at the office, putting the tentative agreement into language that ultimately was ratified by the pilot group. And believe me, you can get sick of pizza. It gets really old after about the third week. And so that's just one of the fun parts of the job.
Yeah, that was a good, behind the scenes look, because there are a lot of long hours outside of active negotiation. And that was another thing we talked about on the last episode. It's not this theatrical thing that you see in a movie. And, I think there was one chair thrown in the last contract cycle, but there's not like chairs being thrown and, people are arguing back and forth. It's a lot of behind the scenes work. Rich, you touched on making sure that one section of a contract or a negotiation doesn't infringe on another section. And that's hugely important, that pilots understand, as you go in with an opener and as you start negotiating and you say, oh, we're really getting gains in this particular section, whatever it may be, that maybe you get those other subject matter experts. This is where the committees come in and those committee chairmen, right? And so you have to weave it all together, because someone may raise their hand and say, well, this is a gain for vacation, but this really messes with our staffing formula. Or this is a gain in some other thing, but it's going to affect scope. And that's the Tetris game that you all play, that the union plays during this pretty delicate time.
No, that's absolutely true. I think we talked a little bit about the previous contracts and a little bit of history at the airline, not just our individual airline, but across the industry, is for the longest time, from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, going into towards the end of the 80s, it was all about progression. The biggest single raise that you ever got in your career was going from first officer to captain and to a lesser extent from second officer to first officer back when that was a thing. And so that was the deal, man. Is you got your upgrade. And that was a huge change in the program for individual pilots. And so that aspect of the contract and that aspect of your career was very, very strongly protected. And that's why you saw hour limits. It was almost virtually impossible to fly more than 75, 76 hours once you hit that mark. In fact, if for some reason you got extended or delayed or random mayhem happens, as it always does, and you hit your monthly max prior to the end of your monthly schedule, your trips dropped. And that was it. Now, as you got further into the 70s and 80s, they came up with different mechanisms to kind of manage that situation. Sometimes we get a lot of questions on the bank, full service bank. That is a kind of a remnant of that system. It still works fantastic. People, utilize it to their great benefit. But that is a remnant of that kind of era. They also had items called the bow wave and the spill back. At Northwest, we called it the negative bank flyback. They're all variations on a theme. But the moral of the story was you were going to fly 75 hours. And the opportunity to do premium pay or to just extra flying at straight pay was extremely limited. And the reason for that was you were protecting that career progression, because that was a huge change of lifestyle when you went from second officer to first officer to captain. As we changed that paradigm going into 2000s, that emphasis has changed because as you well know, we have seen some extraordinary swings in pilot hiring and progression through the airline. So that focus has somewhat waned. It can always come back and bite you if you don't give it its due and look at a historical perspective. I go back and I look at the late 60s as some of the World War II pilots in some, maybe the Korean War vets were starting to retire out of the industry, and Vietnam was absorbing some pilots as well. The trunk airlines, as they called them back in the day, your TWAs, your Eastern, your Delta, certainly American, United. Pan Am was kind of existed on its own. They were actually basically a protected monopoly by the government for international flying. So they were a little bit different, but certainly the trunk airlines are more analogous to what we do today. But they found themselves short of pilots, and they started advertising. Flying Magazine, you can go to Google Books. They have all the issues of Flying Magazine back to the 1920s. You can go in and look at that period of time, and you'll see advertisements. Eastern Airlines is hiring pilots. United Airlines is hiring pilots. You meet these qualifications. And so the interesting thing about that is that was a relatively plentiful time for pilots. As we got into the early 70s, you run into 1972, 1973, and the energy crisis, the OPEC embargo, a lot of drama for a lot of people. In every single one of those pilots who were hired in the late 60s, to most extent, some of the early birds you got in at the very early part did okay. But for the bulk of those pilots, they were all furloughed for an extended period of time. And the pilots who were furloughed and the pilots who remained in their jobs or even maintained their captaincy, sometimes the difference in the day to hire was only about 18 to 24 months. So you can ride this oscillation and look back in history and see it. And you need to take that knowledge and go forward and say, yes, trip coverage, premium time, making sure everybody has an opportunity to feast at the banquet. But we can never lose sight about how quickly this industry can pivot, and you can wind up in a rearguard action very quickly.
Yeah, you talk 60s and 70s, and I know you're not that old, but you're just very well versed in that history. And so I really want to create a lens, and I think this episode does, but it creates a lens for pilots to look through that shows how robust our next contract should be compared to historical ones. And like you say, this is a very volatile industry, or it can be. And so I guess I want to ask you about, the profitability of the company and how that ebbs and flows. And how do you, as a negotiator, how does the MEC really strategize and talk about how much the company can afford, if that makes sense, right? if they're so profitable now as compared to the 90s, and as pilots were quite valuable, they're hiring in record numbers. So there is a commodity effect there. How do you take that into effect or into consideration from your perspective?
So one of the benefits of being part of a national organization or international organization as we are now is that we have an extraordinarily robust economic analysis team, or as we call it, ENFA. We have one dedicated person that's all he does is cost. We have access to, the great resources at national, and every single item that is on the contract is costed. Now, if it may have a zero or negligible cost, or sometimes and sometimes the costs are fixed. Like it's very easy to predict out the cost of 1% of pay or 1% of DC retirement. Some of the other things are a little squishier and you need to make your best assumptions. But costing is always maintained. Tracking the costing may maintain, full awareness of that. And there is always something on the forefront. Obviously, we're going to press the envelope everywhere we can because our pilots are worth it and they certainly deserve it for the jobs that they do every day. But that is always part of the analysis.
Yeah, and I think the importance there is, we're only as valuable as we think we are, and that's across an industry, that's across an economic standpoint. But really encouraging pilots to look through that lens of a history, and things have changed. So you're so good at war stories, and we're going to have you back on for sure. But I want to leave it with one more war story. Let me ask it this way. Give me a war story of your experience in the pilots giving up something in a contract that maybe we still haven't gotten back, and the impact of giving something up or changing something because we don't want to deal with it anymore and never getting that momentum back. Give me a war story.
So some of the things that we've given up over time, it goes back to what I said previously. You can go back and say, hey, some people just want to fly their line. They want to get their 75 hours. They want to be able to upgrade, in a relatively soon amount of time. When that was the priority, you put your card in the time clock and punch the clock and put your time in. I think we've lost a little bit of focus on that. Certainly, with such the rapid turnover, such the rapid progression, we kind of lost sight on how to backstop that in case things in the economy, things in the industry don't turn out as well as they do. The other obvious, kind of frog on the log is the defined benefit pension. We have backfilled that with DC. You ask pilots today now and you say, what would you think of a pension? And oddly enough, out of all the historical perspective in the industry that people tend to push to the side, this is the one thing everybody remembers is I am not interested, and I would say this is for the younger demographic, those who are maybe in my demographic have a different viewpoint on it. We've lived in this environment, even through relatively tough economic times where the market is just on this tear. You're going to get 10, 12, 14, 16% returns every year, or you can go out and you can invest in real estate and put the work in and you get this huge return. And so you mentioned that, something like a defined benefit plan these days, and they're like, no, not interested. Look at the way they held the pilot group hostage and look at the ultimate outcome. Look at the bad outcome for pilots who were caught in the middle. And that is an interesting change in perspective, because we could certainly enter a time where a recession, where the market isn't doing well. And if you are one of those individuals who retires into that down market, that is where the benefit of the defined benefit plans really shine. It's like, well, hey, I'm entering a down market. I'm going to have to burn or eat some of my seed corn for my retirement to just pay my bills from a day-to-day basis. Where instead, if you had a defined benefit plan that is the same check every month, that is regardless of the economy or the chaos that's going on around, that kind of thing, it's easy to get into groupthink on that. Certainly, there are different perspectives, widely differing perspectives on this. But, the things were the way they were for a reason. And sometimes I think it's important to look back at those old structures and say, well, hey, I've got a good portion of my DC plan. I think the market is on this tear. I'm certainly going to retire into beautiful things. but maybe I should really think about making sure I have an adequate backstop. And I think we get so enamored with how great things are in certain circumstances, whether it's in the industry, at our individual airline, or in the economy or world at whole. And sometimes we can lose sight about how quickly that can turn around.
Yeah, that's sage advice from a wise and experienced pilot. So yeah, thanks for that. As we go forward with the Negotiator series, obviously a wealth of information. Next month, you'll hear from our current negotiating team and the negotiating chairman, and we'll give you an update on negotiations. Rich, as April fast approaches and we exchange openers in the first week of April, what do you want pilots to know? What does that mean for pilots and to you personally? Let's end on that note.
Absolutely, positively be unified. We are all in this together. We all do have little nuances on how we look at things, but ultimately we all have the same goal to conclude negotiations successfully. Social media, I doom scroll myself, so I completely get it. But as they say, lie travels around the world before the truth gets its boots on. And I'm not saying anybody would intentionally misrepresent anything on social media ever. I would simply ask that in the interest of making sure that we're all together and we're all kind of reading off the same sheet of music is make sure your facts, definitely read the bulletins that your local council representatives send out. They do tremendous work. Read what the negotiators send out, read what the MEC sends out. If you hear anything that seems a little bit off, it usually is. So if you see anything that looks a little bit wonky, absolutely reach out to your reps and say, hey, I read this on my old MySpace page. What's the real deal with this? And you will get the straight answer. This extends beyond our individual airlines. All of us have friends in the industry, whether they're working with our friends at United, our friends at American, our friends at Southwest. And even those things sound the same, they're not necessarily the same. If I were to go and talk to our friends at United and say, explain to me how reroute works. And first of all, they're going to get a furrowed brow. They're like, well, what are you talking about? Because they call it something completely different. But once you get that frame of reference, you're like, okay, well, now we know what we're talking about together. Explain to me how it works. And they go through their explanation. And you're going to start to see disconnects because, first of all, we don't call things the same thing. Even if we do call things the same thing, they're not the same thing. And because of how intertwined our contract is with every other section of the contract, what they say and what they call something may not act in the same way. And so you talk to your friends at American, for instance, and you say, hey, how does X work? And they say, oh, no, we do this and this. And it may not actually work like that because, we all look at our things through our own lens. And I'm sure we've all known people who didn't have 100% grasp exactly of what we're talking about. No harm. These contracts are extremely complicated. But even assuming what you were told is absolutely correct, it may not translate 1-to-1 or even 2-for-1. So back each other up, read the comms that come out. If you have any questions or things that seem a little bit wonky, make sure you reach out and get your questions answered.
Very good. Captain Rich Wheeler, Executive Administrator from Delta MEC. Hey, thanks for your time and the stories and all your expertise and knowledge on this. We really appreciate it. We can't save all the kittens, but we're certainly going to try.
Absolutely, Ryan. Always a pleasure.
You're listening to Engage, the podcast for Delta pilots. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform, and receive notifications when a new episode is available.